Hi, welcome to the fifth episode of Science Literacy. This is a bit of a special episode, though I hope to have it become less and less special, I guess you could say. Uh, I'm not going to be talking about any one particular thing, maybe a misconception or something like that. I'm going to be talking about literacy in general. To be science literate, you need to be literate. And so we're going to take science literacy to the library. Which library? Well, my library, of course. I have a lot of books. I have a lot of books, both hardback, paperback, so hard copy books. I've also got a lot of Kindle books or ebooks. I've also got a lot of audiobooks. And I've listened to quite a few audiobooks recently over the last several years because at my previous job, when I taught in Virginia, I taught at a school that was almost an hour away from my home. So 2 hours essentially were spent 5 days a week, or every day, 5 days a week, traveling to and from work. Audiobooks kept me sane. Yes, I listened to music from time to time, but audiobooks really were where I turned to and enjoyed them thoroughly. And I was able to go through a lot of audiobooks. So we're going to be focused on a few books today. And looking at these particular books, I'm just going to be describing a little bit about the book, to maybe give you a taste of something that you might be interested in. You might want to go look into it more, or maybe it's a book you've heard about, or maybe it's something that you've never heard of. So one way or the other, I'm just going to give you my opinions about certain books, maybe in a sort of way, maybe just kind of random, whatever I feel like. Hey, I just finished this great book, and here's some other books similar to it, or just other books that I thought you should know about. This episode, the inaugural episode of Science Literacy Goes to the Library, um, is going to be about obviously pandemics and disease. Since that's what the first four episodes of Science Literacy have been about, why not carry that through? And a lot of the information I've gotten for the first four episodes have been from some of these books that I'm going to talk about today. So, we're going to take a look at five books. Depending on how long it takes me to go through each of the books or to kind of describe each of the books, will determine if I get to all five of them. I like to keep these things a little kind of short, or at least at 30 minutes or so, so that one, they're watchable, and they're digestible, I guess you could say. Also, just because you don't need to hear me prattle on for longer than 30 minutes at a time. So, without further ado, let's take a look at these books. Now, I don't have the actual copies of these books with me because most of them are audio, or at least I listened to them with the audiobook, and that's how I was able to basically enjoy them. One book, Pandemic Century, I do actually own a copy of, but it's an ebook, so I have it on my Kindle. But other than that, all four of the others are, or I did actually listen to in order to understand or get their stories. So we're gonna have Pandemic Century. We're gonna have Spillover, which I've mentioned already several times in this particular series, this very young series here. We're gonna take a look at Inferno, which is about Ebola. We're gonna take a look at Ghost Map, which is about cholera, and a somewhat humorous take on, or at least a somewhat humorous history of plagues in general, called Get Well Soon. So we're going to start things off with Spillover by David Quammen. Spillover's full title is Spillover: Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic. How prescient this man was when he wrote this book. Published in September of 2013, it has 592 pages. It is a masterpiece, in my opinion. It is just chock full of information. He could easily have released each individual part of this book as a separate standalone book, and you wouldn't have lost anything with it. Obviously, put it together, and you've got an incredible tome of information. I listened to this book. It took me 2 trips to Michigan and 1 trip across the state in order to fully digest or fully listen to the entirety of this book. Again, a fantastic read. David Quammen spent years studying and researching and just compiling the data that he needed to put this book together. Over 100 chapters. I think it come close to 115, 116 chapters in 8 to 9 parts. Each part focused on a different zoonotic disease, which means a disease that has spread or spilled over from animals into humans. And he kicks things off with a disease I had never actually heard of. It's called the Hendra virus. And the Hendra virus is Australian in origin. Um, and it kind of really became or popped up on the map, if you will, on our radar in the 1990s. And the Hendra virus serves as a fantastic starting point for the zoonotic disease discussion because it's not a simple animal to human transmission. It goes animal to animal to human. So the animal that serves as what's known as the reservoir host, meaning the animal that actually houses the virus, um, all year, all the time, um, doesn't necessarily always directly infect a human. Sometimes it infects another animal, and that animal serves as some sort of amplifier species that then infects the humans. Reasons for this are not fully well known. Why some viruses need an amplifier, but it seems to be the case because, well, the Hendra definitely needed an amplifier, and we've seen this in a few other cases as well. Unfortunately, David Quammen finished this book and published it a full 6, 7 years before, obviously, the current pandemic that we're currently experiencing. But I was able to glean a lot of information from this book that helped inform me about this particular pandemic that we're in the midst of. So many questions were answered by this book, even though it has nothing to do with SARS-CoV-2. It does, however, devote an entire part on SARS-CoV-1, the SARS virus, or the SARS coronavirus, which is the first of the coronaviruses that kind of became highly virulent and very deadly, if you will. So back to Hendra virus to start things off. I'm not going to go part by part because I don't remember what every part was, but I do remember the first one being Hendra because, again, it was something I was not well aware of. But again, it serves as an excellent starting point. Hendra virus in the 1990s went from a fruit bat to a horse to humans. And the questions were, why now? Why has it suddenly popped up? Because humans have been in Africa or in Australia for thousands of years. If we talk about the Aborigines, Europeans since the mid 1700s. But the Aborigines have been there for thousands of years. Bats have been in Australia for maybe even hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of years. Why now, though? Well, the thing is, it may not be a why now. It may not have been a now situation. People may have gotten sick back in the 1700s, back in the 1800s, back in the early 1900s of Hendra. We just didn't know that it was Hendra at the time. It was chalked up as being something else. Now we know. So the question is, again, why now, if this is actually the case? Well, part of the answer is, again, better ability to discover what it actually it is. Second part is horses. Remember, I said that the Hendra virus requires the horse to be the amplifier species. Horses have only been in Australia for just under or around 200 years. So the fact that the horse is a fairly newcomer to Australia means that the virus going from bat to human was not very strong, if that was even a thing. But going from bat to horse to human, well, now that becomes a bit of a problem. And so humans became infected, and it became a pandemic because the Hendra did spread to other locations. Because, again, fruit bats are not isolated to Australia, they do fly into other locations. So it was a pretty big issue, specifically for Australia and the Southeast Asian areas. But it was again, it's a fantastic introduction to the concept of zoonotic diseases. Other zoonotics that he talked about in this book are obviously HIV, AIDS. He devotes a very lengthy part to the HIV virus, which is like saying ATM machine because virus is right there in the name, HIV. Either way, the HIV has been around for a lot longer than people actually think. HIV is a very sneaky devil. Once a person gets infected with HIV, it actually kind of goes dormant, if you will, slowly destroying the immune system of the host, which allows the host to actually stay healthy in a way and spread it into other hosts. Um, there have been numerous spillovers from HIV, or with HIV, from other primates, from monkeys, and apes. And people, the question is, well, how did this happen? Well, bushmeat, what we would call game in our country, shooting deer, going out eating turkey, wild turkeys, that is, um, squirrel, things like that. We call that game. There in Africa, it's called bushmeat. Well, they go out and they hunt bushmeat. They get chimpanzees, they get gorilla. No, not as much gorilla, but they do get gorilla. They get other primates, other simians, and for a variety of reasons, for a variety of purposes. And sometimes it's not thoroughly cooked. Sometimes through the butchering process, you may end up getting a cut on your hand. And if you're working directly with the carcass, it may infect you that way because HIV is not airborne. HIV is spread only through contact with blood, um, semen, or things that have come in contact with those and have not been sterilized. So it is not easy to catch HIV in a sense of, if you're not doing any of those things, then you really have a very low chance. But the fact that most people do, at least one of those in the course of their lifetime, it's going to spread. When it originally was discovered, it's kind of an interesting story because it was discovered at a time when science was able to actually identify it. It's actually a nice serendipitous moment with science, technology, and observational medicine. So, a particular doctor, I think in San Francisco, noticed that a lot of his patients, specifically a large proportion of his homosexual patients, were exhibiting signs or symptoms that were all the same. He kind of did a very, very quick and dirty study, just writing down his observations and said, hey, just want to see if anybody else is seeing these things. And then across the country, in New York, New Jersey area, a doctor saw the same thing. And then in another area, they saw the same thing, again, in mostly the homosexual population. So unfortunately, it got stigmatized and pigeonholed into, this is a gay disease. But it's not, because around the same time, there were Haitians in Florida that were exhibiting the exact same symptoms, but they're they weren't homosexual. They were very heterosexual. So the question then became, well, what's causing this thing to spread? Well, again, they were only able to discover it because science technology had reached the point where they were able to actually observe T cells, which are the target of this virus. So they saw that the T cells were diminishing inside these particular patients, and these people were exhibiting some really crazy symptoms, some diseases that aren't a problem for most people because their immune systems are strong enough to fight them off. Thrush, which is a fungal infection of the mouth, most people don't get that because their immune systems are strong enough to fight it off. But these people with HIV were getting thrush, really bad thrush. Um, a particular type of pneumonia, which is basically fluid in your lungs, which again doesn't affect most people because our immune systems fight it off. But here, these people were immunocompromised and therefore they were exhibiting these signs. All these things were coming together. They tested their blood. They found that their immune systems were basically shut down and they were able to kind of work out what was causing it. And it was this virus. Um, There's also some scientific kind of infighting there between one lab in France and a lab in America, but basically it all comes down to how are these people getting it, and it again comes from Africa, and the eating of bushmeat, the probably caused the infection to spread, spill over from animal into humans. Other particular zoonotics that he talks about in this particular book, SARS, the first coronavirus that basically went pandemic, SARS-CoV-1, and he kind of goes through how deadly it was, how it spread from, again, animals being eaten and passing on into humans, and then here it goes, it spreads to other people. This one did go airborne, and it was brutal. Thankfully, the current SARS-CoV-2 is not as deadly. However, in another way, that's bad because it's infecting way more people because it's not killing as fast as SARS did, SARS-CoV-1. Ebola, dedicates an entire part to Ebola, but I'm going to come back to Ebola in a different book because he actually didn't get to this part because it happened after his book was published in 2013. So again, David Quammen, Spillover, Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic, fantastic book. If you want to know anything about zoonotics, read this book. It is absolutely fantastic. And again, the Audible version is about 20 hours long. It is worth it. It is absolutely worth it though. All right, next up is Pandemic Century. I actually just finished this book. I did actually read this one. It was not an Audible. It was actually a book that I could read. I did, however, read it on Kindle. Actually won it through Goodreads. So shout out to Goodreads. Yay, thanks. I won it in just a little contest that I entered. I'm like, why not? I don't win anything, and I won it. So here we go. Pandemic Century focuses on basically 100 years of pandemics. And you would think it'd start 1900 to 2000. No, it starts kind of late 1900s, or not late, but into the 1900s. It actually starts with the quote unquote Spanish flu, where the influenza outbreak of 1917 or 1918. So starting off with that, the author, Mark Honigsbaum, so Pandemic Century, called 100 Years of Panic, Hysteria, and Hubris, basically breaks down these various pandemics. Again, starting off with the Spanish flu. He investigates why it was so bad, where it went. He doesn't get many answers for that, but he does explain the symptoms and the eventual killer. It wasn't the flu per se. The flu led to a pneumonia that was incredibly deadly and caused people to essentially suffocate. And it was just absolutely horrendous. And it happened at a time we're in the middle of World War One, and the oddly enough, this flu did not really affect um the target audience, if you will, the target groups. With SARS-CoV-2, we're talking about the people most at risk are going to be the elderly. This one seemed to target the healthy, the 20 to 40-year-olds, if you will. The very people that we're sending overseas to fight in this war are the ones coming down and dying from this flu. And it was ravaging through the training camps and the military base camps of Europe as well. Here, as well as here in America. So we don't know why it did that. We don't know why it was so virulent. We don't know where it really came from. Well, we think it came from birds, more than likely as an H1N1 variety. We don't know where it went. It just disappeared, and that's that's scary because it could come back around again. There was recently an H1N1 variety, the swine flu, back in 2009, and because it was an H1N1, and because 2018 or sorry 1918 was also H1N1, we thought, holy crap, this is going to be a big one again, and we prepared and we prepared and we prepared, and then it didn't actually. It wasn't as bad as we thought it was. Yes, people died. Yes, people got sick. I caught it. My wife caught it. We both were eventually okay, but it just was it was weird. It was just you were so tired. You were just so tired. You just didn't want to do anything. It was so um, just debilitating almost. But we survived. We moved on. We were fine. Um, why did the swine flu not be as? Why was it not as bad as we thought it was? Not sure. Other pandemics that is highlighted in this particular book, we have the parrot fever, psittacosis, in the 1930s. We have a plague, like the plague, bubonic plague outbreak in LA in the 1920s. Then there's Legionnaire's disease in the 1970s. Then he talks about obviously HIV in the 1980s and 90s. And he actually gets as far as SARS in the 2000s, and Ebola actually as well, and Zika, just to name a few of the more exotic non United States of America American diseases, pandemics. 448 pages in length, published April 2019. It is actually a really good book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Some people, according to reviews of it, didn't find it to be as good as I found it. They were expecting a little bit more. Like, I guess they were expecting more insight into, say, the Spanish flu or things like that. But I just wanted to know more about these pandemics, and so I think it highlights some of the things that we're doing to fight this pandemic. We did back in the 1970s, 1980s, 1930s, and it didn't work then, and it's not working now. Um, some of the attitudes surrounding these particular pandemics, it was eye-opening to see just the lackadaisical response, or the dismissal of, oh, that's not going to be so bad, and then it's actually really bad. So pandemic century, 100 years of panic, hysteria, and hubris. I do recommend it. I recommend all these books. Pretty much you're not gonna find me give you talk about a book that I'm going to not like. Most of the books I read I thoroughly enjoy. um, Occasionally I come across one or two that I'm just like, "Ugh," but most of these are really good. So that leads me into Inferno, a Doctor's Ebola story by Stephen Hatch, Dr. Stephen Hatch of Massachusetts General, I think, or um, Harvard University's um, hospital system up there. Either way, he's in Boston, and he is an internal specialist, and he kind of specializes in hemorrhagic diseases. Well, here we are, 2014 in West Africa. Yet another Ebola strain pops up in West Africa. Initially, it was kind of ignored and kind of pushed away, like, it's not Ebola, because Ebola has never been seen there. It was seen in Central Africa. The first 5 outbreaks of Ebola were in Central Africa. Here we are in West Africa, and we got Ebola. And again, people just didn't fully understand. They kind of threw it aside. They said, no, it can't be. And yet, here it is. It is actually Ebola. Well, this particular book is a first-hand account from a person who went to West Africa, risked his life in the Ebola triage units they had there, the ETUs, the Ebola treatment units, that were basically ramshackle buildings made of plywood and concrete blocks, with substandard lighting. And it's in the middle of Western Africa, pretty much right on the equator, or at least very close to it. And it's just brutal, the conditions that these people had to work in. And he talks about Ebola and how the people involved. He talks about the the build up to him getting down there, while he's there, coming back over there, all this stuff. It is a very riveting story, and it's read by the author. Again, I listened to the audiobook version. It's read by the author, and so Dr. Stephen Hatch um, really has a passion for this particular disease, and fixing it, trying to fix it. Um, he does not shy away from political opinion, from possible politically incorrect opinions. He calls it like he sees it, and it's a pretty good book in the sense of you get a really good sense of what's happening there. Now, this was not brought up in Spillover because, again, David Quammen published his book in 2013, and this happened in 2014. So in his book Spillover, Quammen talks about, or kind of hints at possible reservoir of Ebola, maybe being bats, but we're not really sure. We're pretty sure now that it's bats. We're not fully 100% certain, but we're pretty close. And again, we find that out in Inferno, a doctor's Ebola story, which it's 320 pages, published March 2017, by Dr. Stephen Hatch. So again, I recommend this book if you have any interest in Ebola as a disease, the particular West African outbreak of Ebola, then definitely read this book. Um, Moving on now to a more ancient disease, if you will. One that it pops up from time to time, but mostly in third world countries, or at least poorly sanitized countries, and that's cholera. This particular book basically is the foundation for, um, well, what we call germ theory. It's a story about Dr. John Snow, who basically discovered that cholera was not a disease from bad smelling air, but found in bad water. So the book is called Ghost Map, a story of London's most terrifying epidemic and how it changed science, cities, and the modern world. And it is about, again, London's 1854 outbreak of cholera. Cholera is a little bacteria that resides in very, very, very bad water, unclean water. You ingest it, you don't see it, you don't taste it. It's there though, and it gets into your body. It goes down your digestive system, through your stomach, and into your intestines, and that's where it goes crazy. It actually attaches itself to your intestines. And your intestines are really good about absorbing nutrients, absorbing water from the foods and the liquids that you ingest. Well, this particular bacterium reverses the process so that your body actually expels water into your intestines, causing you to have really bad diarrhea, and also vomit as well. And that's a way for the bacterium to flush out of your system and move on to a new host, while it reproduces. Now, you can easily be cured of cholera, antibiotics, but in 1854 those didn't exist, or hydrating. If you stay hydrated, most of the people that hydrated constantly with clean water ended up surviving and were fine. Now, that does not make you immune to cholera. It just means that you don't die. This particular strain, or this particular epidemic, was horrific. People were dying within days. Usually cholera takes a few days before it kills you. Some people were dead within 24 hours in this particular epidemic. Well, Dr. John Snow decided to. He was not satisfied with the whole bad air concept. This epidemic happened in a really dirty part of London, and everybody wanted to get their clean or get water from this particular pump. There were public water pumps, and this particular pump was called the Broad Street Pump. And apparently the water was really good. It tasted really good. And people were coming from all over the place that had grown up there and they come back. In fact, one lady lived in a completely different part of London. In fact, I don't even think she lived in London. I think she lived in another town, but she would actually have this water from the Broad Street pump shipped to her from by her family because she loved it so much. That was the only water she would drink. And that's actually the I guess the nail in the coffin, if you will. A lot of people around Broad Street were dying from cholera. There were some really bad situations happening, and Dr. John Snow was as an attending physician was attending to these people, and he noticed almost all of their stories were about the Broad Street pump. So he got water from the pump and he examined it, but he couldn't see anything. It was clear. It had a decent taste. He actually drank some of it, but he didn't drink a lot of it. And other qualities, just it didn't seem bad. But these people were all of the cases were kind of centered around the pump, and that's why it's called Ghost Map because he actually mapped out the infection and it's centered around this pump. And then, of course, you have stories from outside of London of cholera, and they've got water from the Broad Street pump. Long story short, because it's only 299 pages, compare that to 592 pages of David Quammen's book. But Stephen Johnson, the author, did an amazing job telling the story of Dr. John Snow and his discovery that it was not miasma, which is bad smell or foul smelling air, that caused cholera, but actually dirty water. And that really kind of opened the door for better sanitation, for better plumbing, for better city action and governmental, I guess, um, oversight, as well as paved the way for germ theory to really start taking hold because. Most people thought it was bad air that made you sick. In fact, the word malaria means bad air. So even we call something a disease that comes from mosquitoes bad air. That's its name because it was once thought to be from swampy, bad foul air. So, published in November 2006, The Ghost Map Story of London's Most Terrifying Epidemic and How It Changed Science, Cities, in the Modern World. I didn't know much about cholera until this book, and this book really opened my eyes to cholera. I enjoy teaching in environmental science about waterborne diseases and focusing on cholera because of this book. It was just unbelievably fascinating. Um, all right, last book, because I really am kind of out of time here, but last book I wanted to get to because it kind of fit this profile is Get Well Soon, History's Worst Plagues, and the Heroes That Fought Them by Jennifer Wright, 336 pages, published in February 2017. I picked this particular book because I think I heard a little snippet of it and it sounded funny. It was humorous. So I was like, I gotta hear the rest of the book. So I checked the book out from the library and listened to it, and it was fascinating. Jennifer Wright does a good job, not just highlighting or kind of profiling these particular plagues, starting with the Antonine and Justinian plagues of hundreds or whatever BC, to the dancing plague, to the bubonic plague, to other various diseases and plagues over the course of human history. But she also talks about the treatments of these particular diseases, and it's just ridiculous some of the way these things were treated. For instance, in the dancing plague, at one point, if you're not familiar with the dancing plague, was basically people in this small town in Germany started dancing for no reason whatsoever, and they danced themselves to exhaustion, and essentially some of them died because they weren't eating or drinking, and they were so physically fatigued that they just had no will to live anymore. Some early attempts at fixing this plague or this disease, because other people were afflicted with it as well, were to invite musicians to play music for these poor people dancing, because they thought that, well, they'll stop dancing after the music stops. No, they kept dancing. It wasn't because they were listening to music or they needed music. They couldn't stop themselves from dancing. We think it's a fungal infection today that caused this particular disease, but one way or another, just the attempts at fixing these problems were rather humorous. So If you want a more lighthearted disease story, if you will, I recommend Get Well Soon: History's Worst Plagues and the Heroes Who Fought Them by Jennifer Wright. It is she takes it seriously. Don't get me wrong, she does take it seriously, but she does provide a little bit more humor, or at least a dryness to it, so that you kind of see how some of these can be kind of silly, or at least the perceptions of them at the time. It is a little bit of a little bit of levity in a very serious topic. So those are some just five books that I have had personal contact with, or at least have read and basically processed. And I've used them to inform some of the information that I have given to you in the first four episodes, and will continue to do so in the next coming episodes. So that was Spillover by David Quammen, Pandemic Century by Mark Honigsbaum, Inferno by Dr. Stephen Hatch, Ghost Map by Stephen Johnson, and again, Get Well Soon by Jennifer Wright. So that concludes our inaugural episode of Science Literacy at the Library. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope something there struck you as possibly being interesting, and maybe you will kind of get get some entertainment and information out of them as I did. All right, bye.